The expanding universe. Surah Adh-Dhariyat. 51:47 states, "And the heaven we constructed with strength, and indeed, we are its expander." A verse written around 610 to 632 CE that some modern Islamic scholars interpret as describing cosmic expansion. The Arabic word musi'oon in this verse has been translated variously as expanding, vast in space, or we have power, leading to significant debate among linguists and theologians about its intended meaning. Edwin Hubble discovered in 1929 that galaxies are moving apart, and the Big Bang theory was formalized between 1927 and the 1960s by Georges Lemaître and others, establishing that the universe has been expanding since its origin approximately 13.8 billion years ago. According to proponents of this interpretation, the verse's reference to expansion suggests knowledge of cosmic mechanics more than 1,300 years before modern astronomy confirmed it. However, mainstream historians and Arabic linguists dispute this reading, noting that classical Islamic commentaries, or tafsir, from scholars like Ibn Kathir and Al-Tabari, do not interpret this verse as describing physical cosmic expansion, but rather as poetic language emphasizing God's power and the vastness of creation. The debate illustrates the tension between reading modern scientific concepts into ancient religious texts and understanding them within their historical and linguistic context. Embryonic development stages. Surah Al-Mu'minun 23:12-14 describes human development in stages. Nutfa, a drop or sperm. Alaqa, a clinging thing or clot. Mugha, a chewed lump. Followed by bones, then flesh, and finally another creation, which some Islamic scholars interpret as aligning with modern embryological understanding. This passage, written in the 7th century CE, has become one of the most cited examples of alleged scientific knowledge in the Quran, particularly after claims emerged in the 1980s that embryologist Keith L. Moore confirmed its accuracy at Islamic conferences. However, critics point out that Greek physicians, notably Galen around 150 CE, described similar developmental stages centuries before the Quran, and that Greek medical texts from Alexandria were accessible in 7th century Arabia. The descriptions themselves are somewhat vague and metaphorical, using observable terms like clinging and chewed lump that could refer to the appearance of miscarried embryos, which ancient peoples would have encountered. Modern embryology, established in the 19th and 20th centuries with microscopy and cellular biology, provides far more detailed and accurate descriptions than either Greek or Islamic sources. Scholars note that Moore's statements have often been misrepresented, and classical tafsir literature treats these verses not as detailed medical descriptions, but as theological statements about God's creative power and human development. Mountains as stabilizers. Multiple Quranic verses describe mountains as pegs or stakes that prevent the earth from shaking, with Surah An-Naba 78:6-7 asking, "Have we not made the earth a resting place, and the mountains as stakes?" And Surah An-Nahl 16:15 stating, "And he has cast into the earth firmly set mountains, lest it shift with you." Some modern Islamic scholars interpret these verses as demonstrating knowledge of mountain roots and plate tectonics, noting that mountains do extend deep into the Earth's crust through isostasy, discovered in the late 19th century, while plate tectonics theory was developed in the 1960s and 1970s. However, geologists point out that this interpretation misunderstands mountain formation. Mountains result from tectonic plate collision, not the cause of Earth's stability, and they form at the most seismically active zones where earthquakes are most frequent. Ancient peoples across cultures observed mountains and perceived them as permanent, stable features, making references to their stabilizing role, a natural reflection of observation, rather than advanced geological knowledge. Classical tafsir literature interprets these verses theologically as examples of God's design rather than scientific descriptions of geological processes. The image of mountains as stakes or pegs is poetic language emphasizing their perceived permanence in making the Earth habitable, not a technical description of isostatic compensation. Barrier between fresh and salt water. Surah Ar-Rahman 55:19-20 states, "He released the two seas, meeting side by side. Between them is a barrier, so neither of them transgresses." With Surah 25:53 describing a similar concept of two bodies of water meeting without mixing. Modern Islamic scholars interpret these verses as describing haloclines or pycnoclines, zones where water masses of different densities meet in estuaries, straits, or ocean layers, creating visible boundaries where mixing is limited. This oceanographic phenomenon is real and observable at locations like the Strait of Gibraltar, river mouths, and fjords, where fresh water from rivers meets salt water from oceans, creating a visible line of demarcation due to differences in density, temperature, and salinity. However, this phenomenon was observable to ancient mariners and coastal peoples who regularly witnessed these natural boundaries, making it accessible knowledge in the 7th century rather than hidden scientific information. Additionally, while haloclines do exist and slow mixing, they are not permanent barriers. Diffusion and turbulence cause the waters to gradually mix over time, meaning the boundary is temporary rather than absolute as the verse might suggest. Classical tafsir interpretations view these verses as demonstrating God's power to create order and separation in nature, using observable phenomena as theological illustrations rather than presenting advanced oceanographic data that would only be discovered through modern scientific instruments. The iron sent down from heaven. Surah Al-Hadid 57:25 uses distinctive phrasing about iron, stating, "And we sent down iron, wherein is great military might and benefits for the people," with the surah itself named Al-Hadid, meaning the iron. Some modern interpreters focus on the Arabic verb anzalna, meaning sent down, suggesting it indicates knowledge that iron came from space, which aligns with scientific understanding that most of Earth's iron arrived via meteorite bombardment during planetary formation approximately 4.6 billion years ago, and that all heavy elements, including iron, were forged in supernova explosions before our solar system formed. However, this interpretation faces significant challenges because ancient peoples had direct experience with meteoritic iron, which was collected and used for tools and weapons as far back as 3000 BCE, over 3,600 years before the Quran. Furthermore, the verb anzala appears 88 times in the Quran and is used for many things, including revelation, rain, livestock, and blessings, almost always in a metaphorical sense, meaning provided or revealed, rather than literal physical descent from the sky. Classical Islamic scholars interpreted sent down as God providing or revealing iron's usefulness to humanity, not as a statement about stellar nucleosynthesis or meteoritic origins. The linguistic evidence suggests this verse uses common, Quranic language about divine provision, rather than making a specific astronomical or geological claim about iron's extraterrestrial origins. Fingerprint uniqueness. Surah Al-Qiyamah 75:3-4 mentions fingertips specifically in the context of resurrection. Does man think that we cannot assemble his bones? Yes. We are able even to proportion his fingertips. Modern Islamic interpreters suggest this specific mention of fingertips demonstrates knowledge, that they serve as unique identifiers, a fact not scientifically established until Francis Galton's work in 1892 proved fingerprint uniqueness, and their use in forensic identification began in the early 20th century. However, this interpretation faces substantial criticism because the full context of Surah 75 concerns resurrection and God's power to recreate humans perfectly after death, not human identification or forensic science. The mention of fingertips serves as an example of God's precision and ability to recreate even the smallest, most delicate details of the human body, demonstrating thoroughness rather than highlighting uniqueness for identification purposes. Classical tafsir literature, including commentaries by Ibn Kathir and Al-Tabari, interprets this verse theologically as emphasizing God's meticulous creative power, with fingertips chosen because they represent fine detail and complexity, not because they're unique to each individual. Ancient peoples did not use fingerprints for identification, and there's no evidence that pre-modern Islamic scholars understood this verse as referring to forensic uniqueness, making this one of the most contested scientific miracle claims due to its clear theological context and the absence of any identification-related interpretation before modern fingerprint science emerged. The water cycle. Various Quranic verses describe components of the water cycle, with Surah Az-Zumar 39:21 stating, "Do you not see that Allah sends down rain from the sky and makes it flow as springs in the earth?" along with other verses describing evaporation, cloud formation, and precipitation. Modern Islamic scholars point to these descriptions as evidence of advanced meteorological knowledge, noting that the complete water cycle wasn't scientifically formalized until the Renaissance period when Pierre Perrault, Edmé Mariotte, and Edmund Halley quantified it in the 17th century. However, the basic concept of the water cycle was well understood by ancient civilizations long before Islam, with Greek philosopher Aristotle describing evaporation, condensation, and precipitation in his work Meteorologica around 350 BCE, more than 1,000 years before the Quran. Chinese texts documented similar processes even earlier, and natural observation made the cycle evident to any society living near water. People could see rain falling, rivers flowing to seas, and water evaporating from puddles. Ancient Arab peoples would have been familiar with these phenomena through direct observation of their environment, including seasonal rains, wadis, filling and drying, and the Arabian Peninsula's limited water resources. The Quran's descriptions are accurate and demonstrate engagement with the natural world, but they reflect commonly understood natural philosophy rather than unique scientific insight hidden from ancient peoples and only confirmed by modern hydrology. Darkness in deep oceans and internal waves. Surah An-Nur 24:40 describes ocean conditions. Or, they are like darknesses within an unfathomable sea, which is covered by waves, upon which are waves, over which are clouds. Darknesses, some of them upon others. Modern interpreters suggest this describes deep ocean darkness, where sunlight cannot penetrate, and internal waves between water layers of different densities. In oceanography, light penetrates only about 200 meters into the photic zone, beyond which lies complete darkness, not directly observed until 20th century deep sea exploration with submersibles. Internal waves forming at boundaries between water layers were discovered in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. However, the verse's context is crucial. It appears as a simile comparing disbelievers' state to darkness, not as oceanographic description. The phrase waves upon waves could describe surface phenomena observable to any sailor, with wind-driven waves creating ripples on larger swells or waves crashing during storms. Classical tafsir interpretations by scholars like Ibn Kathir understood this as metaphorical language about depths of disbelief and ignorance, not technical ocean layering description. The multi-layered imagery of clouds blocking sunlight, surface waves, and deep darkness creates a metaphor for spiritual darkness rather than oceanographic treatise, and reading modern marine science into this poetic passage represents an interpretive leap from its original theological purpose of illustrating the state of those far from divine guidance. The sun's movement through space. Surah Yasin 36:38 mentions the sun's movement, and the sun runs on course toward its stopping point. That is the determination of the exalted in might, the knowing. Modern interpreters suggest this demonstrates knowledge that the sun moves through space, orbiting the Milky Way's galactic center approximately every 230 million years, at roughly 828,000 kilometers per hour, discovered in the early 20th century when astronomers identified the solar apex. However, classical Islamic commentaries from scholars like Ibn Kathir and al-Tabari interpreted this verse differently, understanding it as the sun's apparent daily motion across the sky, its annual path through the zodiac, or the sun's eventual end. The Arabic verb tajri means runs or flows, and was traditionally understood as describing observable solar movements from Earth's perspective, which ancient peoples witnessed daily. The term mustaqar, translated as stopping point, has been interpreted variously as the sun's appointed setting place, resting point, or ultimate endpoint, none specifically suggesting galactic orbit in classical interpretations. Ancient civilizations, including pre-Islamic Arabs and Greeks, observed the sun's movements across the sky and through seasonal positions, making references to solar motion natural within their observational framework. The modern interpretation connecting this verse to galactic orbit represents a reinterpretation in light of contemporary astronomy rather than a meaning evident to original readers or classical scholars. Skin and pain receptors. Surah An-Nisa 456 describes hellfire punishment. Indeed, those who disbelieve in our verses, we will drive them into a fire. Every time their skins are roasted through, we will replace them with other skins, so they may taste the punishment. Some modern interpreters claim this demonstrates knowledge that pain receptors are concentrated in the skin, not discovered scientifically until nociceptors were identified in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. However, this interpretation is widely criticized as one of the weakest scientific miracle claims because the verse's purpose is theological, describing the severity and continuity of divine punishment in hellfire, not providing an anatomy lesson about nervous system distribution. Anyone who has experienced burns or skin injuries knows that pain is felt in the skin, making this observable knowledge available to all human societies throughout history, without requiring understanding of specific nerve endings or receptor mechanisms. Ancient medical traditions, including Greek, Roman, Persian, and Arab medicine, recognized that skin damage caused pain based purely on observation of injuries and burns. The verse emphasizes God's power to perpetuate punishment by regenerating skin, ensuring continuous suffering, which serves the theological purpose of warning believers about consequences of disbelief. Classical tafsir literature treats this as a description of hellfire's intensity rather than medical information about dermal nociceptor distribution, and even some modern Islamic scholars acknowledge this interpretation stretches the verse's intended meaning beyond its clear theological context about divine justice and punishment. Pairs in creation. Multiple Quranic verses reference pairs or mates in creation, with Surah Adh-Dhariyat 51:49 stating, "And of all things we created two mates." Perhaps you will remember, and Surah Yasin 36:36 declaring, "Exalted is he who created all pairs, from what the earth grows, and from themselves, and from that which they do not know." Modern interpreters suggest these verses demonstrate knowledge of sexual reproduction throughout nature, including in plants where male and female reproductive organs weren't scientifically identified until Rudolf Jacob Camerarius proved plant sexuality in 1694, and Nehemiah Grew studied plant anatomy in 1682. The pairing in animals is obviously observable, with male and female clearly distinguished in species humans regularly encountered, but plant sexuality is less evident to casual observation. However, ancient civilizations practiced artificial pollination of date palms as early as 4000 BCE in Mesopotamia, and this knowledge was present in pre-Islamic Arabia, where date cultivation was economically important. The reference in verse 36 to "from that which they do not know" could suggest hidden pairs in plants or other unseen pairings, though this phrase could also be interpreted more broadly as metaphorical language about balance and duality in creation. Classical Islamic scholars often understood pairs theologically as representing complementarity and balance in God's creation rather than making specific botanical claims. Additionally, Not all organisms reproduce sexually. Many plants are hermaphroditic, and various species reproduce asexually through budding, fragmentation, or parthenogenesis, complicating the universal pairs claim. The protective atmosphere. Surah Al-Anbiya 21:32 describes the sky, "And we made the sky a protected ceiling, but they, from its signs, are turning away." Modern Islamic scholars interpret this as demonstrating knowledge that Earth's atmosphere protects life by blocking harmful ultraviolet radiation, burning up meteorites before they reach the surface, and maintaining temperature and pressure conditions necessary for life. Functions scientifically understood primarily in the 20th century after the ozone layer was discovered in 1913. The atmosphere does indeed block approximately 99% of harmful UV radiation, incinerates most meteors through friction heating, and creates stable conditions through the greenhouse effect. However, ancient peoples across cultures observed meteors burning up in the sky, understood that weather and atmospheric conditions were essential for life, and recognized the sky's role in providing rain and regulating seasons through direct observation. The term protected ceiling uses the Arabic word saka'ef, which means ceiling or roof, potentially suggesting a solid structure reminiscent of ancient cosmological models, where the sky or firmament was conceived as a physical dome over Earth. Classical tafsir interpretations often understood this verse theologically as emphasizing God's providential care in creating conditions for human life, rather than as technical atmospheric science. While the verse accurately describes the atmosphere's protective functions, the language could be poetic or metaphorical, celebrating the sky's observable role in sustaining life, rather than detailing specific atmospheric chemistry or physics. If you want to see more, click the video on screen now.